November 1942, Ironbottom Sound. Radar found the enemy first, but torpedoes decided the night. The U.S. Mark 14 misfired and ran deep. Japan's Type 90. 3 reached out 20 miles and struck without a wake. Task Force 67's combat information centers lit with fresh SG radar returns shortly before midnight, 30 November 1942. American screens saw what doctrine promised they would: approaching Japanese destroyers ferrying supplies to Guadalcanal. The range was comfortable for gunnery control. The United States Navy entered the action with confidence born of microwave radar and armored cruisers. What they could not see was the longer arithmetic already in motion, the geometry of a torpedo duel in which the Imperial Japanese Navy's Type 93 outranged and outhit its opponents. By late 1942, the U.S. Surface Force and its submarine arm shared a common assumption about torpedoes. American designs were advanced, safe, and reliable. The Mark 14 standard in U.S. submarines advertised 4,500 yards at 46 knots and carried a 668-pound Torpex warhead. Its surface ship cousin, the Mark 15, was similar in concept. Both used the Mark 6 magnetic influence contact exploder, Mark 6, a delicate mechanism intended to detonate beneath a target's keel. Japan's Type 93, by contrast, was often dismissed in pre-war U.S. analysis as too dangerous to handle, employing pure oxygen to burn kerosene fuel. The specification sheets told a colder truth. The Type 93 could range on the order of 22,000 yards at 48 knots, with a warhead of roughly 1,080 pounds, Type 97 explosive, and it left almost no wake. When Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka's destroyers turned to fight off Tassafaronga, they exploited that reach. American destroyers fired first, U.S. Cruisers opened rapid salvos guided by radar plots, and yet, within minutes, the heavy cruiser USS Northampton was mortally wounded, while Minneapolis, New Orleans, and Pensacola were each struck and left burning or crippled. Japanese torpedoes had detonated with brutal effect at ranges that U.S. commanders did not expect to be decisive. The U.S. side also launched torpedoes, but numerous American weapons either missed or failed to detonate. Historiography. Contemporary tallies vary. Some U.S. on us. After-action reconstructions list Japanese launches as low as to 8 and others much higher. American expenditures likewise range by source. The tactical asymmetry was rooted in engineering choices. Japan's oxygen system, developed through risky pre-war experimentation, enabled energy density and range that compressed night actions into Japanese decision cycles. The U.S. Mk-6 exploder and depth control system, meanwhile, embodied peacetime economizing and insufficient live-fire trial. In 1942, Pacific Fleet submarines reported failure rates well above 70%, torpedoes that ran 10 to 15 feet too deep, magnetic pistols that pre-detonated or didn't detonate, and contact pistols whose firing pins deformed at high impact angles. Surface force weapons shared many of the same failure modes. Voices from the record show how quickly operators lost faith. Vice Admiral Charles A. WW2 Lockwood, who would assume command of Pacific submarines in 1943, later summarized the frontline sentiment: "If the Bureau of Ordnance can't shoot torpedoes, we will." Paraphrase. Lockwood, COMSUBPAC, Memoir, Sink M. All, 1951. In test memoranda the following summer, Captain Charles B. W.W. Swede Mommsen, the Navy's most respected diving and salvage officer turned ordnance troubleshooter, wrote plainly, "The Mark 6 exploder is defective." Mommsen, 1943 test report. From patrol reports came lines that sting, even in paraphrase: "Observed 4 hits, 4 duds. Target escaped." U.S. Submarine Patrol Report, C. 1942. Tassafaronga's statistics reinforced the trend that Guadalcanal crews already sensed from earlier night actions off Savo and Cape Esperance. The U.S. edge in sensing SG radar could detect a destroyer beyond 20,000 yards was being nullified by a weapon that could be launched from outside the assumed threat ring and arrive fast, heavy, and silent. The kinematics were unforgiving. At 48 knots, a Type 93 covered 10,000 yards in about 6 minutes. At 46 knots, a Mark 14/15 launched from 4,500 yards had barely a 2-minute time of run. Japanese doctrine, built for a decisive night battle, trained crews to fire large spreads at long range, then comb American counter-torpedo tracks with aggressive maneuvering. American doctrine, assuming shorter effective ranges and reliable influence detonations, had not been proofed against an adversary with both range and a warhead nearly 60% heavier. Production and testing numbers tell the institutional story behind the flashes on Ironbottom Sound. In the interwar years, the Bureau of Ordnance, BuOrd, conserved live-fire tests. Too costly, too few targets, and wartime torpedoes were scarce in 1942. Depth keeping was calibrated in instrumented tanks and protected ranges, not through systematic shots against real hulls. By contrast, the IJN had spent heavily on torpedo schools and night tactics, accepting accidental losses from oxygen handling as the price of range and speed. When war imposed its audit, the U.S. discovered that untested assumptions failed with regularity, while Japan's high-risk engineering paid immediate tactical dividends. The night of 30 November did not decide the war, but it defined the problem. American cruisers, saved only by compartmentation and damage control, limped away. Northampton sank. Japanese destroyers, though mission-frustrated in resupply, demonstrated once more that their torpedoes could erase American positional advantage. The feedback loop was clear in the documents that followed. Lockwood ordered live shots at instrumented nets and actual hulks. Mommsen's teams replicated failures, and frontline commanders started to discount the Make-6's promised benefits in their plans. At Tassafaronga, U.S. radar made first contact, but Japanese torpedoes set the terms of combat. The IJN's oxygen torpedo reach and doctrine converted night actions into long-range torpedo duels, exposing U.S. peacetime testing gaps and turning presumed technical superiority into a battlefield liability. The U.S. Navy's torpedo enterprise clustered around the Naval Torpedo Station on Goat Island, a compact campus of draftsmen, machinists, and Bureau of Ordnance, BuOrd, engineers. In the last pre-war budget cycles, they refined a triad: the Mark 14 torpedo for submarines, the nearly identical Mark 15 for destroyers, and the Mark 6 influence exploder to trigger a keel-breaking blast. The idea was elegant detonate beneath a ship where plating is thin and shock waves multiply damage. But elegance substituted for evidence when money, secrecy, and testing policy collided. Peacetime budgets limited live firing. A single torpedo represented months of skilled labor and specialized alloys. Recovering test rounds demanded calm water, tracking ranges, and ships held out of service. The result was a culture of simulation. Depth keeping was certified in instrumented tanks and short-run range shots. Exploder sensitivity was proven in bench rigs and magnetic field labs, not on steel hulls. In 1938, despite a decade of development, the number of full-up, warhead-equipped, live shots against real targets remained very low, uncertain, fewer than a few dozen across the 1,930 seconds. Unit costs reinforced caution. A Mark 14 cost on the order of 5 figures in $1940. Uncertain to $10,000, $13,000. And BuOrd prioritized inventory over destructive trials. Secrecy compounded the shortfall. The Mark 6's magnetic pistol was classified restricted distribution, and access was limited to select officers and engineers. That secrecy fragmented feedback loops. Fleet operators seldom saw how the pistol behaved near different latitudes. Earth's magnetic field varies, or at acute impact angles. Newport's laboratory assumptions, nominal depths, standard approach angles traveled to the fleet as doctrine. When a Pacific submarine later reported premature detonations or silent hits, the first reflex in 1942 would be to question plotting or crew procedure, not the device. The engineering numbers looked persuasive on paper. A Mark 14 carried 668 pounds of Torpex, a mixture with roughly 1.5 times the energy of TNT, promising keel failure. The weapon could make 46 knots for 4,500 yards or slow to extend endurance. The Mark 6 added a double insurance: magnetic influence for underkeel action, plus a contact firing pin as backup. Acceptance tests showed stable gyros and tight spreads on range. Yet early Pacific patrols would find depth errors of 10-15 feet, enough for a torpedo set to 5 feet to pass under a destroyer without contact. The contact pistol, meanwhile, failed at high closing speeds. The firing pin could deform on a direct high-angle strike, producing a clank and no detonation. Each failure mode tracked back to a test that had never been run in anger at Newport. Personalities mattered. Commander, later Rear Admiral, Ralph W. Christie, long associated with Newport's program, championed the Mark 6 and defended its integrity well into 1943. From Newport's vantage point, the data fit. Bench tests were rigorous, and reports of duds from distant theaters looked like scattered anomalies. In the Pacific, a different pattern cohered. Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, who would take command of COMSUBPAC in early 1943, recalled the operational tempo. "We found too many fish that simply would not explode." Paraphrase. Lockwood, Memoir, 1951. The tension between shore-based certainty and frontline evidence hardened into institutional friction. Documents from 1937-39 show how the system arrived at war unproven but certified. Live warhead trials against obsolete hulks were rare. Inert heads with recording gear were common. Latitude correction tables for the magnetic pistol were simplified. The Earth's field variations were acknowledged, but not exhaustively mapped for combat conditions. Meanwhile, production accelerated. By mid-1941, the Navy had placed substantial orders. Hundreds of Mark 14 bodies, exploders, and spare parts flowed through Newport and partner yards. Output, not experimentation, became the dominant metric. A factory could cite monthly throughputs, a range shot that sank, a target taught much but destroyed an asset the Navy felt it could not spare. The opportunity cost was conceptual. U.S. doctrine assumed shorter effective engagement ranges because the torpedoes assumed to work were tuned to such ranges. A submarine captain could plan to fire at 1,000–2,000 yards with confidence in underkeel effect. A destroyer division planned torpedo runs inside gunnery range. Against an adversary with a 20,000-yard wakeless weapon, those assumptions inverted risk. The Type 93's 1,080-pound warhead and 48-knot speed meant a Japanese spread could be launched from beyond radar-directed gun comfort, forcing U.S. ships to navigate an unanticipated lethality bubble. The first strong hints of systemic failure were present even before Pearl Harbor, in scattered anomalies and rejected hypotheses. Some pre-war trials recorded unexplained depth excursions. A few contact pistols misfired at sharp angles in cold tank tests. Each was logged and rationalized. Seams only burst under the stress of 1942's operations, when, patrol after patrol, skippers described patterns. Hit observed at frame. No detonation. Paraphrase from patrol reports. Magnetic prematures at short setting. Paraphrase. Captain C.B. Swede. Momsen's later diagnostic teams would show on instrumented shots that the depth sensor bellows had calibration biases and that the contact pistol's striker could peen and jam on high-speed impact findings that a handful of destructive tests in 1938 might have revealed sooner. In letters and memoirs, the principal scientists and officers speak in measured tones. One can hear both pride and frustration. Pride in interwar craftsmanship and frugal innovation, frustration that the war's audit arrived all at once. As one Newport engineer summarized after the war, paraphrase, "We built a thorough test regime of the parts we decided to test. The missing parts live warheads on steel hulls, high-angle strikes at full speed, latitude-variant magnetic curves were exactly those that would decide early Pacific engagements. Budget caution, secrecy, and a bench-first culture certified an elegant design without full-scale proof. The Navy entered 1,941 with high confidence, low evidence, and a weapon whose untested edges, depth, influence, and impact physics would fail under combat load." Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood had been in the COMSUBPAC chair for 6 months when he authorized what Newport had avoided for a decade: destructive, live-fire trials in the open ocean. The purpose was not to refine paperwork. It was to answer the simplest operational question: why did so many hits fail to sink targets? From late spring into August 1943, Pacific Fleet submariners and Captain C.B. Swede, Mommsen's diagnostic team, executed a brute force testing program, live runs at instrumented nets to measure true depth, inert heads fired at plates to study impact dynamics, and warshot detonations against expendable targets to verify fusing at speed. Uncertain. One series used an obsolete hulk near Hawaiian waters. Another used reinforced nets with calibrated depth marks. The numbers stripped away theory. Torpedoes set to run at, say, 10 feet consistently tracked 10-15 feet deeper, enough to pass under many destroyers and some merchants. In influence mode, the Mark VI frequently prematured in the Earth's variable magnetic field, especially at higher latitudes or during sharp maneuvering. When the magnetic feature was disabled and the contact pistol alone was relied upon, a different failure appeared. At high impact speeds and direct angles, the firing pin housing deformed and jammed, producing a non-detonating glance. Field estimates through early 1943 put failure rates above 70%, on some patrols an intolerable figure in a campaign, judged by tonnage sunk and fuel denied. Lockwood's response was administrative and mechanical. First, he ordered the magnetic influence feature deactivated across COMSUBPAC boats, spring-summer 1943. Second, he directed depth cam corrections, set the weapon shallower by roughly 10 feet to compensate for measured bias. Value varied by boat and lot. Third, under Mommsen's supervision, contact pistols were modified, striker tips hardened, and bearing surfaces relieved to survive high-speed square impacts. The results were immediate in test shots. Contact. Only runs began to produce reliable detonations on properly set depth tracks. In a memorandum tone characteristic of Mommsen, the conclusion was plain. The Mark VI exploder is defective. Mommsen, test report, 1943. Lockwood's own summary, written later, captured the operational mood. If the Bureau of Ordnance can't shoot torpedoes, we will. Paraphrase, Lockwood, COMSUBPAC. Resistance remained. Rear Admiral Ralph Christie, commanding submarines in the Southwest Pacific, COMSUBPAC, had long been associated with the Mark VI's development. In his theater, many boats kept the magnetic feature active longer, and some reports credited influence shots with spectacular kills. Historiography. Views diverged. Some skippers swore by influence in certain sea states. Others reported clusters of prematures. The split underscored the friction defined in the analytic brief. Field commanders who saw the pattern daily versus a shore establishment invested in its pre-war design. By August 1943, however, The Pacific Fleet practiced magnetic off, corrected depth, strengthened contact pistols became the de facto standard in COMSUBPAC. Quantification linked fixes to outcomes. A 21-inch Mark 14, properly corrected, still carried 668 pounds of torpex, enough to break a 5,000, 7,000-ton freighter's back with a single underkeel or clean side hit. With the magnetic mode off, under-keel effects were rarer, but side detonations at 46 knots produced repeatable structural failures at typical engagement ranges of 1,800 yards. Patrol reports from late 1943 began to show sinkings per patrol rising markedly, uncertain, median claims shifting from low single digits toward 2 to 3 ships per successful patrol, aligning with Allied shipping loss data. The causal chain from depth error to miss, from jammed striker to dud, from magnetic premature to lost contact was reversed. The trials also clarified training. Approach officers revised their fire control assumptions. Expect contact bursts, not influence breakbacks. Shoot for machinery spaces or magazine zones. And use 2- and 3-shot spreads tuned for target length and angle on the bow, rather than believe in a single underkeel miracle. Instructors emphasized maintenance metrics, striker inspection intervals, exploder alignment checks, and depth gear calibration after heavy seas. The fleet learned to treat torpedo lots like aircraft engines. Each had a personality, each demanded data. Frontline voices record the pivot. One skipper's post-fix patrol report, paraphrase, C. Mid-1943, reads, 4 shots, 2 hits, 2 explosions, target settled by the stern. The same officer's prior crews had read bleakly, observed 4 hits, 4 duds. Target escaped, patrol report, C. 1942. The change was not luck. It flowed from destructive testing that Newport's peacetime regimen had deferred. It also required a cultural switch. Deference to BuOrd gave way to theater-level authority to alter, test, and standardize. None of these corrections erased the IJN's torpedo advantage in the surface war overnight. The Type 93 still reached out to roughly 22,000 yards at about 48 knots, with an 1,080-pound charge, and Japanese night doctrine still leveraged that reach in 1943. But the submarine war in the Central and North Pacific began to match its potential only after the Mark 14's effective reliability climbed. Missed opportunities measured in hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping not sunk in 1942, early 1943, would not be recovered. Yet by late 1943, the curve bent in the United States' favor. Pearl Harbor's 1943 brute force trials replaced assumption with measurement, turning off influence, fixing depth, and hardening the contact pistol, transformed the Mark 14 from a paper design into a workable weapon too late to avert early losses, but in time to enable the submarine campaign's surge. By mid-1943, the Long Night campaign in the Central Solomons had become an audit of 2 doctrines. American task groups entered each action with SG radar, plotting tables, and destroyer screens designed to deliver radar-directed gunnery. Japanese destroyer flotillas arrived with Type 93 torpedoes preset for long-range spreads and crews drilled to fire first, turn away, and let oxygen propulsion do the killing. 2 engagements, Kula Gulf, 6 July, and Kolombangara, 13 July, show the trade. Sensing advantage versus striking reach. At Kula Gulf, a mixed force under Rear Admiral Walden Ainsworth intercepted a Japanese reinforcement run. The light cruiser USS Helena, fitted with SG radar and confident in rapid gunfire, illuminated targets and scored early hits. Minutes later, she absorbed multiple torpedo impacts and broke apart, sinking before dawn. Historiography. Sources differ on the exact count. Contemporary U.S. accounts generally attribute 3 Type 90, 3 hits. The kinematics favored the attacker with reach. A Type 93, running approximately 48 knots, closed 12,000 yards in about 7 minutes. Its low-wake signature gave minimal warning. The U.S. destroyer's mark 15 seconds. Similar in essential features to submarine mark, 14 seconds, remained shorter-legged and suffered related fusing uncertainties. Gunfire killed ships. Torpedoes decided outcomes. 6 nights later, off Kolombangara, Ainsworth returned, again confident after radar contact. His cruisers, Honolulu and Street, Louis, joined by HMNZS Leander and a destroyer screen, engaged a Japanese column escorting the light cruiser Jinsu, U.S. salvo shattered Jinsu, which later sank, but Japanese destroyers launched a fan of type 93 seconds from beyond what American commanders assumed to be decisive torpedo range, Honolulu and Street. Louis were both struck and disabled. Leander took a hit that flooded machinery spaces. American torpedoes fired in reply had mixed results. Post-action reports recorded numerous runs with few confirmed detonations. Historiography. Launch counts vary. Some reconstructions list Allied shots in the dozens versus Japanese spreads of perhaps 1 to 2 dozen. The pattern across both battles illustrates the operational arithmetic. U.S. radar could detect and track at 20,000 yards and beyond, enabling early gunnery solutions. But when an adversary's torpedo range approaches that same scale on the order of 22,000 yards, first detection does not guarantee first effective blow. Japanese destroyers fired from outside the range envelope. Most U.S. captains assumed for torpedoes. With warheads of roughly 1,080 pounds of Type 97 explosive, a single hit could remove a cruiser's bow or jam turrets by shock. The American Mark 15, carrying about 825 pounds of torpex and nominally capable of to 6,000 yards at high speed, uncertain, figures vary by setting, still depended on a contact or influence system that shared the Mark 14's weaknesses in 1,942, mid-1943. Quotes from participants reveal simultaneous confidence and shock. A U.S. gunnery officer later recalled paraphrase, "We were hitting them then. The ship lurched like a hammer blow, and the forward compartments were gone." A Japanese destroyer officer from Tanaka's forces summarized doctrine in post-war interviews, paraphrase, "Fire at long range. Turn away. Do not wait for gun duels to settle the matter." Contemporary American analysis echoed the lesson. Historian and Naval Reserve officer Samuel Eliot Morrison, writing soon after the war, emphasized the tactical surprise of torpedoes arriving from beyond expected range, paraphrase, Morrison, Solomon Islands, Volume 1949. The technical premise, energy density from oxygen enabling 20-mile attacks, had become a nightly fact. Quantification frames the trade space. Consider the time of run. A Type 93 at 48 knots needs roughly 6 minutes to cover 10,000 yards. A cruiser gunnery solution might take tens of seconds to establish and walk onto the target, but gunfire decays with maneuver and smoke. Torpedoes ignore smoke, and at night are detected late, if at all. Consider also the relative explosive yield. An 1,080-pound Type 93 charge versus a 668-pound Mark 14 divided by 825-pound Mark 15 means structurally different outcomes when detonations occur. Bow removal versus local plating, failure, especially near magazines or steering compartments. In both July engagements, hits translated into mobility kills or catastrophic flooding within minutes. American adaptation within the month was visible but incomplete. Destroyer tactics began to emphasize evasive combing the tracks once torpedoes were suspected. Cruiser captains tightened formation discipline to reduce overlapping target angles. Radar talkers learned to treat sudden gaps in enemy tracks as launch cues rather than maneuvering errors. Yet material fixes lagged the July timeline. while COMSUBPAC in Pearl Harbor was already stripping magnetic pistols from Mark 14 seconds and correcting depth, surface forces in the South Pacific still carried Mark 15 seconds with contact pistols vulnerable to high-speed, high-angle impacts. A destroyer division commander wrote after Kolombangara, paraphrase, "We have eyes over the horizon. They have a fist from over the horizon." The attrition tally across the two nights bears out the thesis. In exchange for sinking Jintsu and damaging several destroyers, the Allies lost Helena and suffered 3 cruisers torpedoed into months of repair. Measured in operational availability, the IJN's torpedo exchanges removed thousands of tons of Allied combat power from the theater for the rest of the campaign. Those losses did not reverse the strategic arc. American shipbuilding and logistics were scaling, but they prolonged the night-fighting learning curve at precisely the moment when Guadalcanal's ground campaign had become a logistics race. July 1943 proved that radar advantage could not offset a torpedo overmatch at night. The IJN's oxygen-powered reach converted early U.S. detections into Japanese striking opportunities, forcing Allied commanders to rethink ranges, formations, and what decisive meant in a nocturnal sea fight. Japan's oxygen torpedo did not appear fully formed off Guadalcanal. It was the product of a pre-war decade in which the Imperial Japanese Navy accepted unusual technical risk to buy night battle leverage. At Yokosuka's torpedo school and Kure's naval arsenal, engineers and line officers refined the Type 93's core bargain: use pure oxygen, not air, to oxidize kerosene, raise energy density, and drive a large, fast, almost wakeless weapon to unprecedented ranges. The price was danger handling high-pressure oxygen amid fuel and grease, managed by strict procedures and a hard training culture. The physics favored Japan's choice. Air is roughly 21% oxygen and 78% nitrogen. Nitrogen contributes nothing to combustion but expands in the exhaust, creating a visible bubble, wake. Fill the flask with nearly pure oxygen, and 2 gains appear at once: more oxidizer per unit volume, and little inert gas to vent. The result is more energy delivered to the turbine and a greatly reduced wake. In IJN trials through the 1,930 seconds, this translated into operational settings on the order of 22,000 yards at roughly 48 knots for the surface-launched Type 93, with a warhead of about 1,080 pounds of Type 97 explosive metrics. No Allied fleet matched before 1944. Historiography. Precise tables vary by lot and setting. Allied analysts reconstructed ranges post-war from fragments and tests. The risk was real. Pure oxygen at high pressure accelerates combustion, turns minor contamination into fires, and can detonate lubricants or gasket residues. Japanese instructions mitigated this with an almost ritual sequence: flood lines with inert gas, then oxygen, verify filters, keep fittings surgically clean, crew drills repeated until muscle memory. Accidents did occur in the 1,930 seconds. Training notes allude to burn casualties and occasional practice round explosions, uncertain counts and dates. But the institutional judgment held the tactical payoff outweighed the hazard if procedures were obeyed. As one IJN torpedo officer recalled in a post-war interview, paraphrase, "We feared oxygen, but we feared losing the night battle more." Doctrine drove the investment. Japanese war planning assumed a U.S. fleet advancing across the Pacific to a decisive engagement near the inner defense lines. To attrit the enemy before daybreak gunnery, destroyer flotillas would launch long-range spreads at night from outside the enemy's expected torpedo envelope, then turn away. The torpedo, not the gun, would be the first decisive blow. That doctrine shaped training hours and ammunition budgets. Torpedo school curricula emphasized spread geometry, laddered depth, and fan angles for targets maneuvering at 25-30 knots. Destroyer divisions practiced night station keeping, coordinated launch timing, and rapid course reversals to avoid counterfire and to comb any incoming tracks. Quantification reveals the embedded priorities. A Type 93's warhead to 1,080 pounds is approximately equal to 490 kilograms, delivered a shock load capable of blowing off a cruiser's bow or wrecking propulsion spaces with a single hit. 2 hits often proved fatal within minutes. At roughly 48 knots, the weapon crossed 10,000 yards in to 6 minutes. Fired from 15,000 yards, it arrived in to 9 minutes. A U.S. cruiser's radar-directed gunnery could achieve hits in less time once a solution was established, but could not erase torpedoes already in the water. Tactically, Japanese flotillas sought to launch first at long range, then allow closing gun duels to unfold under a field of already running torpedoes. The industrial program matched doctrine. Kure and Sasebo arsenals fabricated large-diameter oxygen flasks, precision regulators, and robust turbine sections to tolerate higher thermal loads. Wartime intelligence later marveled at the machining tolerances and surface finishes recovered from fragments. A 1,944 U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence note on captured components observed, paraphrase, exhaust trace minimal, propeller cavitation suppressed, wake hardly visible at night, uncertain, exact phrasing. Japanese supply chains also prepositioned oxygen charging gear forward, Rabal, Shortlands, later Truk, so destroyers could rearm during intense night operations, sustaining the tempo seen in 1942-43. The cultural context stands out next to American practice. The U.S. Navy prized safety and logistical regularity. Pre-war torpedo budgets prioritized quantity and standardization. Testing emphasized bench and range validation. Japan, accepting greater hazard, pushed live firing, nighttime spread drills, and shipboard oxygen discipline to the forefront, where U.S. torpedo crews often trained with inert heads and kept live warhead shots rare. IJN destroyermen, ingrained launch sequences, and casualty control measures under the eye of officers who expected to attack at night at long range. As an IJN flotilla commander summarized, paraphrase, speed to position, fire without being seen, do not contest light with gun flashes. Allied navies underestimated the result. Before 1942, Long Lance was not the name Allied officers used. That label spread later as wreckage analysis and after-action reports converged. Early war U.S. estimates treated Japanese torpedoes as roughly comparable to the U.S. Mark 15 inches speed and range. Combat corrected that error. The sudden appearance of torpedo hits at what crews believed to be beyond range forced revisions to plotting assumptions, zigzag patterns, and formation spacing. When U.S. destroyers began to carry radar and HF divided by DF confidently, the Type 93 preserved Japanese striking power after dark, neutralizing the sensor overmatch by altering the fight's geometry. Quotes, bracket, the calculus. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, whose destroyers repeatedly bloodied Allied cruisers around Guadalcanal, later framed the weapon's role, paraphrase. Our torpedoes decided the night. A U.S. action report from late 1942 captured the American learning curve, paraphrase, torpedo tracks, observed at ranges previously considered improbable. And from a captured IJN manual, translation, paraphrase, strict cleanliness in oxygen gear. Any oil is forbidden, launch procedure must not be hurried. Analytic conclusion. The Type 93's dominance was not accidental hardware luck. It was the engineered instrument of a night battle doctrine that accepted oxygen risk for range, speed, and stealth. In 1942-43, that trade inverted Allied assumptions and delivered decisive striking power precisely where radar could not prevent it. The torpedo problem's strategic cost is best measured not by shattered bows at Ironbottom Sound, but by ships that did not sink merchantmen that delivered oil, bauxite, and troops because American weapons failed. Across 1,942 and into the first months of 1,943, U.S. submarines stalked Japan's sea lanes from the Bismarcks to Formosa with aggressive tactics and expanding patrol areas. Their contact rates were adequate, their kill rates were not. The delta between approach and effect, the gap between hit observed and ship sunk, is where the Mark 14's defects translated into tonnage Japan kept. Operational logs show the pattern. Submarines often fired from 1,800 yards, well within the Mark 14's 46-knot, 4,500-yard high-speed setting, and aimed for under-keel detonations promised by the Mark 6 exploder. Instead, depth errors of roughly plus 10-15 feet caused torpedoes to pass beneath destroyers and many medium freighters. Where contact was made, the striker sometimes peened and jammed at high angles, yielding a dead blow. Patrol reports compiled by early 1943 estimated overall failure rates north of 70% in some divisions, with clusters of prematures and duds ruining end around setups that had consumed hours of maneuver and fuel. A single patrol might expend 12-18 torpedoes for one confirmed sinking. Uncertain, ratios varied widely by boat and month. An inefficiency that dulled the campaign's pressure on Japanese shipping. Quantification sharpens the counterfactual. Japan entered the Pacific War with a merchant marine on the order of 6.6. 5 million gross registered tons, historiography, differing baselines by category, and its oil flow from the Netherlands East Indies depended on vulnerable tanker routes through the Makassar and South China Seas. If early war U.S. torpedoes had detonated reliably, even modest improvements, say, converting half of the 70% failure tranche into successes, could have added hundreds of thousands of tons to 1,942 sinkings. The 20-month delay, often cited by submarine officers, the period from December 1941 to the broad adoption of magnetic, depth-corrected, reinforced contact practice in mid-1943, thus maps to a material opportunity cost. Cargoes delivered that might otherwise have been lost, escorts undeployed that might have been diverted, convoys unrerouted that later tightened. Uncertain, precise missed, tonnage estimates vary. Some post-war analyses infer several 100,000 tons. Frontline voices captured the frustration. One skipper wrote after a fruitless end-around in late 1942 paraphrase. 2 solid strikes at 1,200 yards. Geysers rose. Target continued on. Another noted the morale cost. Crew confidence shaken by repeated duds. Approach officer hesitates to press inside 1,000 yards. Paraphrase from patrol debriefs. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood later reflected on the cumulative effect. Paraphrase. The boats brought courage and contact. Our weapons often failed to keep faith. Lockwood, Memoir, 1951. Captain C.B. Swede, Momsen's test findings gave those laments a mechanism. Depth bias, magnetic prematures, and striker deformation, each a discrete fixable fault, had conspired to depress outcomes. Tactically, unreliability distorted behavior. Approach officers split spreads to hedge against duds, increasing torpedo expenditure per target. Some favored closer shots to increase hit probability, increasing counter-detection risk from escorts and aircraft. Others, burned by prematures in influence mode, experimented with shallow settings before any theater-wide directive existed, producing inconsistent practice across squadrons. The result was a patchwork campaign in which bravery and contact could not be banked as tonnage without dependable fusing. Meanwhile, Japanese convoy defense, initially thin adapted. By late 1942, zigzag routines, more escorts on key routes, and air cover around choke points raised the cost of repeated approaches and made second chances rarer. The strategic timeline matters. 1,000 1942 and early 1943 were windows, when Allied surface forces were still learning night fight counters to Type 93, and when long-range air power in the Southwest Pacific had not yet reached saturation. Submarines, theoretically, could have been the consistent pressure on Japan's sea arteries. Instead, the audit by combat consumed months, while fixes were proven and promulgated. Once COMSUBPAC standardized the 1943 corrections magnetic OF, depth minus 10 feet, typical correction, hardened contact pistol, the curve bent. By late 1943 and into 1944, sinkings per patrol rose. Tankers and Maras burned with regularity. The correlation between shots fired and ships lost tightened. But the cost of the delay had already been paid in fuel burned by ships that should have been on the bottom. Numbers from later periods hint at the foregone 1,942 potential. In 1944, when reliability finally converged with aggressive doctrine and plentiful boats, U.S. submarines sank on the order of 2.5 million tons in that year alone. Historiography, figures vary with claim adjustments. If even a fraction of that per-month efficiency had existed in 1942, the cumulative effect on Japanese logistics oil delivered to truck, troops ferried to New Guinea, bauxite shipped to the home islands would have been felt earlier. That counterfactual cannot be proven. It is strongly inferred from the difference between pre- and post-fix performance with similar crews and platforms. Material culture records the pivot in mundane metrics. Torpedo shops began logging striker inspections by patrol. Boats carried checklists to verify depth, gear calibration after heavy seas. Squadron staff compared dud rates by lot number and manufacturer. What had been an article of faith, the exploder works, became an empirical variable to be measured and corrected. As one squadron gunnery officer wrote in mid-1943, paraphrase, "We will no longer argue abstractions. Show me your net shot depth trace." The Mark 14's defects translated into a strategic lag. Contacts without kills, in the very months when Japan's logistics were most vulnerable. When destructive testing finally produced simple fixes, submarine lethality surged, confirming that the earlier shortfall was not in crews or tactics, but in a weapon certified without proof. The torpedo crisis matured into a policy fight as unmistakable test results from Pearl Harbor collided with years of Bureau of Ordnance, BuOrd, assurances. What began as scattered patrol complaints had, by mid-1943, become a body of measurement. Depth traces showing plus 10-15 feet error. Influence pistols prematuring in ordinary maneuvers. Contact strikers jamming on square hits. Theater commanders now possessed numbers, not impressions, and they used them to demand authority to alter weapons in service. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood's August 1943 directives magnetic influence OF, depth set shallower by roughly 10 feet, boat and lot dependent. Reinforced contact pistols were the field standard in COMSUBPAC. In Washington, BuOrd accepted portions of this regimen piecemeal while defending the Mark VI's design logic and the limited pre-war test base that had certified it. The exchange shows in memoranda tone. A BuOrd note, paraphrase, conceded, "Latitude variation complicates influence firing, but urged caution." Lockwood's reply, paraphrase, cited repeatable net shot data and war shot plates proving striker deformation. Captain C.B. Swede, Mommsen's report removed any remaining ambiguity. The Mark VI exploder is defective. Mommsen, 1943 test findings. The fleet would henceforth fight with contact-only torpedoes, set to verified depths. Quantification framed the turnaround. In early 1943, units estimated failure rates as greater than 70% on some patrols. By early 1944, after fleet-wide adoption of the fixes, dud claims fell sharply, uncertain, often into the teens or lower, varying by lot and conditions. Where a 668-pound Torpex charge previously clanked, it now broke plating, flooded machinery spaces, and produced consistent mobility kills. Patrol lethality rose accordingly. The measure that mattered in staff charts, ships sunk per torpedo, expended, tightened, as spreads of 2 or 3 weapons at 1,800 yards produced regular detonations. At the same time, the surface Navy pushed matching corrections into the Mark 15 for destroyers, improving contact performance even as Japanese destroyers still wielded Type 93 seconds with tilde 1,080-pound charges and to 22,000-yard reach. Institutional friction remained concentrated in the Southwest Pacific. Rear Admiral Ralph W. Christie, long tied to the Mark 6's development and then commanding COMSUBPAC, allowed continued use of magnetic influence in his theater into late 1943, citing and celebrating a handful of dramatic underkeel kills. Historiography. Some skippers reported success in particular sea states. Others saw clusters of prematures. The divergence complicated standardization. Yet even there, experience narrowed options. As more boats adopted contact-only settings with corrected depths, reports of prematures declined and sinkings rose. By 1944, common practice across theaters aligned with COMSUBPAC's 1,943 regime, regardless of enduring loyalties to the influence concept. The correction coincided with the arrival of new types. The Mark 18 electric, reverse-engineered in part from a German pattern, entered service in late 1943, 1944 uncertain. Initial combat issue dates by squadron vary. Its trade was clear. Slower speed is approximately equal to 29-30 knots, and a warhead on the order of to 575 pounds. Torpex, uncertain exact, in exchange for a much reduced wake and better stealth against alert escorts. Fired at to 1,000 yards in a submerged approach, its invisibility often outweighed its lethargy. Later, acoustic homing weapons like the Mark 27 Cutie 19-inch class, small warhead, uncertain exact, gave submarines a defensive shot against pursuing destroyers. None of these erased the Type 93's surface war overmatch, but together they expanded the U.S. Navy's torpedo toolset and shifted tactical possibilities in 1944. The policy lesson hardened into procedure. Where pre-war Newport had certified by bench rigs and limited range shots, 1,943-44 created a new norm, destructive proof. Squadrons kept striker inspection logs. Depth, gear calibration was verified after heavy weather. Lot numbers were tracked against dud claims. Instruments that had lived in laboratories moved to waterfronts. A Pearl Harbor ordnance officer summarized the shift, paraphrase, "We do not accept a claim without a shot. We do not accept a shot without a trace." Theater commanders also won the prerogative to modify weapons to local findings, reversing the pre-war doctrine that a centrally certified device should be uniform and untouched in the field. Personalities left a paper trail. Lockwood's memoir distilled frontline sentiment into a single line: "If the Bureau of Ordnance can't shoot torpedoes, we will." Paraphrase, COMSUBPAC. Mommsen's dry engineering prose delivered the kill shot to the influence pistol. BuOrd's engineers, post-war, wrote in tones of constrained regret, defending their pre-war caution while acknowledging that comprehensive live warhead tests would likely have revealed the defects sooner, paraphrase. The disagreements were real, but the outcomes converged. By mid-1944, American submarines regularly translated approach geometry into explosions, and destroyers increasingly trusted their contact pistols when they braved torpedo attacks at night. Numbers from the wider war show the impact of institutional repair. U.S. submarines' annual sinkings climbed steeply. By 1944, they destroyed on the order of 2.5 million tons. Historiography. Totals vary with claim adjustments. The ratio of torpedoes fired to ships sunk improved markedly against 1,942 baselines. Critically, the order of battle had not changed as dramatically as the results. The decisive variable was weapon behavior. In the surface fight, the United States still faced the IJN's Type 93 at Surigao and Leyte, but by late 1944 Allied radar, air coverage, and numbers suppressed opportunities for long-range night ambushes. Torpedo parity arrived not by matching the Type 93's oxygen risk, but by removing self-inflicted unreliability and fielding specialized alternatives where they fit. The how matters beyond 1,943-44. Peacetime budget discipline had rewarded inventory over destructive trial. Wartime necessity inverted that logic. The system that emerged, fleet-led testing, destructive verification, and local authority to implement fixes, became a template for later U.S. Navy weapons programs. The moral was not that central laboratories were wrong and operators right. It was that assumptions require proof at the scale and speed of real combat loads. Once the fleet imposed destructive proof and local authority, reliability rose and strategy could cash patrol contacts as tonnage sunk. The Bureau fleet friction did not vanish, but measurement displaced assumption, and the U.S. undersea campaign reached its intended weight in 1944. With surrender papers signed aboard USS Missouri, the Pacific's weapons ledger could finally be audited without guesswork. The night fight narrative that began in 1942 with shattered bows off Guadalcanal now read as a study in doctrine, testing, and time lost. Japan's Type 93 oxygen-propelled to 22,000-yard reach at roughly 48 knots, warhead to 1,080 pounds, had done exactly what its pre-war designers intended: decide the night at long range. The U.S. Mark 1446 knots to 4,500 yards, 668 pounds. Torpex arrived at war elegant on paper and unproven at scale. Between those two lines of specification lay the U.S. Navy's 20-month correction cycle and the strategic cost carried by ships that did not sink in 1942, early 1943. Post-war boards assembled the record from patrol reports, workshop logs, and captured documents. The Mark VI influence pistol's defects were now beyond dispute. Net shot traces and hulk trials had measured depth errors of plus 10-15 feet on many lots through mid-1943, magnetic prematures clustered at certain latitudes and approach angles, and the contact striker deformed on high-speed, high-angle hits. Each was a discrete engineering miss. Together, they produced failure rates estimated above 70% on some early patrols. When COMSUBPAC memoranda in spring-summer 1943 ordered magnetic off, applied a typical depth correction on the order of missed 10 feet, and hardened the striker, dud claims fell sharply, and the submarine campaign's tonnage curve turned upward into 1,944. The counterfactual, often voiced in quiet tones by submarine officers in 1945, was quantitative. If even half of the 1,942 observed hits that failed had been explosions, the added sinkings might have totaled in the hundreds of thousands of tons. Tankers through the Makassar and South China Seas, slow Maroos off New Guinea, and reinforcement convoys to Rhode would have faced a steeper attrition slope before Allied air and surface strength matured. The IJN could not have manufactured time. Its oxygen torpedoes bought nights, not ships. In the ledger of opportunity, the Mark XIV's early defects granted Japan a year of better odds on its sea lanes. For surface forces, the lesson rested in geometry and doctrine. Allied radar SG sets detecting beyond 20,000 yards won the sensing battle early. Yet at Kula Gulf, Kolombangara, and especially Tassafaronga, the Type 93's envelope reached into radar's comfort zone. Launch fans from to 12,000 18,000 yards, arrived 6 to 9 minutes later with warheads nearly 60% heavier than the U.S. Submarine standard, delivering bow removals and machinery space floods that gunfire alone seldom matched. Radar superiority could cue gunnery. It could not erase already, running torpedoes invisible in darkness. As an IJN destroyer officer summarized in a post-war interview, paraphrase, "Fire first at long range, turn away, let the water carry the blow." The American fix was procedural as much as mechanical. Captain C.B. Swede, Mommsen's 1943 judgment. The Mark VI exploder is defective, became policy, not heresy. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood's frontline maxim, "If the Bureau of Ordnance can't shoot torpedoes, we will." Paraphrase, translated into authority for theater commanders to alter fuses, cam depths, and inspection regimens. The culture shifted. Acceptance by bench data gave way to destructive proof on instrumented nets and sacrificial hulks. Lot, tracking, and post-patrol striker checks became routine. The Mark 18 electric brought a stealth option, is approximately equal to 29-30 knots, smaller wake, and the late-war Mark 27 Cutie added a defensive homing shot, incremental tools enabled by a system now comfortable with fielded variation and measurement. By late 1944, parity arrived by subtraction and scale, not by mirroring oxygen risk. American destroyers still confronted Type 93 seconds in Philippine waters, but carrier air, radar pickets, and numbers constrained night ambushes. Submarines, now firing contact-only depth-corrected Mark 14 seconds and growing numbers of Mark 18 seconds, sank on the order of 2.5 million tons in 1944 alone. Historiography. Totals vary with claim adjustments. What changed was not courage or platforms. The fleet of 1,942 had both but a testing philosophy. Weapon behavior finally matched tactical expectation. The documentary point returns to the analytic angles stated at the outset. First, peacetime budget discipline. One torpedo costing on the order of 5 figures, $1,940, tilted the U.S. system toward simulation and away from live detonation against steel hulls. That economy produced a wartime deficit. Second, the friction between operators in the rear echelon was not temperament but epistemology, patrol reports and net shots versus bench rigs and restricted memos. When the fleet possessed repeatable traces, policy changed. Third, oxygen propulsion was a real hazard and a real enabler. Japan accepted burn and explosion risk to buy range, speed, and a near-wakeless track. In 1942-43, that risk paid a tactical dividend that Allied radar could not cancel at night. Finally, time mattered. The 20-month delay in U.S. torpedo correction is not an artifact of memoir. It is legible in tonnage tables and repair logs. The last voices are brief, as they should be. Mommsen's line, defective, is the hinge of the American story, a quiet engineering verdict that unlocked reliability. Lockwood's paraphrased threat to do in theater what the Bureau could not do at Newport is the institutional turn, and a U.S. destroyer division summary after Kolombangara, paraphrase, closes the operational loop. We have eyes over the horizon. They have a fist from over the horizon. In 1945, with the fighting over, that fist became a case study. Decisive weapons are not slogans or line items. They are numbers proven under the loads they must bear. Japan's Type 93 succeeded because doctrine, industry, and training were aligned to a risky technology that delivered long-range wakeless blows. The U.S. Mark 14 failed because assumptions went untested. Only brute force trials fixed it. That 20-month lag translated directly into ships not sunk in time Japan briefly bought at sea.